I arrived at Port Ahern on the 20th of September with 2 duffel bags and a cashier's check for $900 that would cover my first month in the bunkhouse. The ferry terminal sat at the end of a gravel access road that wound down through second-growth spruce, and when I stepped out of the shuttle van, the air smelled like diesel and kelp and something sharper I would later recognize as glacial runoff. The water in the basin was the color of wet slate. The woman at the operations window wore a fleece with the BC Coastal Ferry Service patch and didn't look up when I set my hire paperwork on the counter. Callaway? Yes. You're replacing Hendricks. That's what the email said. She stamped 3 forms and slid them back. Bunkhouse is the blue prefab past the fuel depot. Your keys in locker 73. Combinations the last 4 of your social. Captain wants you on the dock at 1900 for orientation. Don't be late. Understood. Radio's channel 8, weather channel's 12. You don't use any other channels. I nodded and she finally looked at me. Her eyes were pale and steady. You got debts? The question startled me. I'm managing them. That's why you took a mid-watch ferry post in October. That's why. She almost smiled. Then you'll stay longer than most. Locker's open now. The bunkhouse smelled like propane heat and old coffee. Locker 73 held a stiff orange survival suit, a laminated radio protocol card, a flashlight with fresh batteries, and a ring of 7 keys on a steel carabiner. Each key had a stamped number. I counted them twice. A handwritten note taped inside the door read, "Count your keys at the start and end of every shift. If the count is wrong, radio the captain immediately. Do not board the vessel." I memorized the line and peeled the note free. My bunk was a narrow cot with a wool blanket and a pillow that smelled faintly of someone else's shampoo. The window faced north across the basin toward the mountains. I could see the ferry tied at the main dock. A double-ended roll-on roll-off vessel maybe 200 feet long, white hull with a red waterline, passenger cabin amidships. The Nordling. I'd looked her up online before accepting the job. Built in Norway in 1987, refitted twice, certified for 50 passengers and 12 vehicles. She ran a triangle route between Port Ahern, Kirkland Inlet, and Moss Harbor, carrying mail and freight and the occasional tourist or contractor. The mid-watch shift departed Port Ahern at midnight and returned at 0600, 6 nights a week, October through April. I needed the money. At 1855, I walked down to the main dock with my radio clipped to my belt and the keyring hooked through a loop on my jacket. The wind had picked up and the water chopped against the pilings. The Nordling sat low and quiet, her loading ramp down, interior lights off. A man stood at the base of the gangway. He wore a black wool cap and a waterproof jacket with captain's stripes on the shoulders. Callaway. Yes, sir. He didn't offer his hand. I'm Captain Voss. You're my deckhand, and you'll also handle lines and light cargo. You've worked boats before? Fishing boats. 2 summers in Alaska. Good. You can tie a cleat hitch and you won't puke in the galley. That puts you ahead of Hendricks. He turned and gestured toward the vessel. Walk through now. Stay close and don't touch anything unless I tell you. I followed him up the gangway. The deck was non-slip steel, clean but scarred by years of use. He led me forward past the cargo tie-downs, pointing out the fire extinguisher mounts, the bilge access panels, the emergency flare locker. His voice was flat and procedural. We entered the passenger cabin through the starboard door. Rows of bench seats bolted to the deck, a small galley counter with a coffee urn and a microwave, a restroom aft with a narrow door. Everything smelled like industrial cleaner and salt air. Passenger capacity is 50, but you'll rarely see more than 8 or 9 this time of year, Voss said. Mostly contractors heading to Kirkland. Sometimes a government ranger or a supply driver. Tourists don't run this route after September. Understood. He walked me up the interior stairs to the pilot house. The helm was analog. Wheel, throttle levers, compass, radar screen, VHF radio, depth sounder. A clipboard hung from a hook near the chart table. Voss tapped it with one finger. Manifest and passenger log, you check it before we cast off and again before we dock. If a name is on the log, that person stays in the cabin or on deck where you can see them. If someone's not on the log, they don't board. What if they insist? They don't board. I glanced at the clipboard. The top sheet was blank except for a date stamp. One more thing, Voss said. He opened a steel drawer beneath the chart table and removed a single folded sheet of paper. The creases were worn soft. This is your operational briefing. Read it now. If you don't understand something, ask. If you understand and won't comply, walk off the dock tonight and don't come back. He handed me the paper and stepped back to the helm, watching the dark water through the windscreen. I unfolded the sheet. The text was typed in a sans serif font, single-spaced, no header, numbered 1 through 12. 1. Departure is at midnight exactly. If the dock clock reads later than 00.01, do not cast off. Radio the captain and wait for instructions. 2. Count all passengers as they board. Verify the count against the manifest. If the count does not match, do not cast off. Remove the additional person or persons and verify again. 3. Between midnight and 00:45, keep the passenger cabin lights on. After 00:45, turn them off. Do not turn them back on unless the captain instructs you. 4. Do not enter the restroom between 01:10 and 01:30. If a passenger is inside during this window, do not knock. Wait until 01:31. 5. If you hear knocking from inside the cargo hold, do not open the hold door. Note the time and report it to the captain at the next scheduled radio check. 6. At 02:00, conduct a passenger count. If the count is higher than the manifest, identify the additional person. Do not speak to them. Radio the captain immediately. 7. Between 02:15 and 02:35, do not look directly at the water on the port side. If you must move along the port rail, keep your eyes on the deck or the cabin. 8. If a passenger asks you to deliver a message to someone at Kirkland Inlet or Moss Harbor, and the request is made between 03:00 and 03:45, decline politely. Do not accept any written notes or objects during this window. 9. At 04:00, turn the passenger cabin lights back on. Conduct a final passenger count. If the count is lower than the manifest, search the vessel. If you do not locate the missing person within 10 minutes, radio the captain. 10. Do not acknowledge anyone who calls you by your first name unless you personally know them and they are listed on the manifest. 11. If you see a person standing on the aft deck facing the stern at any time between 01:00 and 05:00, do not approach them. Note their clothing and position. Radio the captain immediately. 12. At 05:50, prepare for docking. Verify all passengers are accounted for. If the manifest count and the physical count match, proceed with standard docking. If they do not match, do not dock. Radio the captain and hold position until instructed. I read the list twice. My hands were steady, but my pulse ticked up. The wording was precise and operational, like safety protocols. But the content didn't match anything I'd seen on fishing boats or commercial ferries. Questions? Voss said without turning around. What happens if I break one of these rules? Someone gets hurt. Who? Depends on the rule. Sometimes you, sometimes a passenger, sometimes both. I folded the paper. What are we dealing with out here? Voss turned and looked at me for the first time with something like focus. You're dealing with a job. You follow procedures and you go home in the morning. You don't follow them, you don't. That's the contract. Is this why Hendricks left? Hendricks lasted 3 weeks. He didn't follow procedure. Voss took the paper from my hand and returned it to the drawer. You keep a copy of this list in your head. I don't print extras. If you can't remember 12 rules, you can't work this shift. I can remember them. Good. We depart in 2 hours and 40 minutes. Fuel check is at 2300. You'll help me with the walk around. Go get your survival suit and meet me back here at 2250. I nodded and left the pilot house. Outside, the wind had picked up and the dock lights threw sharp shadows across the deck. I walked back to the bunkhouse and sat on my cot with the radio in my lap. Channel 8. I clicked through to 12 and listened to the weather report. Winds 15 knots from the northwest, seas 2 to 4 feet, freezing level at 3,000 feet. I switched back to 8 and set the radio on the floor. Then I pulled out my phone and opened the Notes app. I typed out all 12 rules from memory, checking each one twice. When I was sure I had them right, I deleted the note and turned the phone off. At 2250, I was back on the dock in my survival suit with the key ring clipped to my belt. Voss was already on deck, moving through the walk-around with a flashlight. I followed him, watching as he checked the mooring lines, the bilge pumps, the fuel caps, the running lights. He worked without speaking, his movements economical. When we reached the cargo hold door, he paused and aimed his flashlight at the locking mechanism. This stays locked unless we're loading or offloading. You have a key, but you don't use it underway. Clear? Clear. He tested the lock and moved on. At 2352, we stood in the pilot house and he powered up the instruments. The radar screen flickered to life. He adjusted the gain and checked the depth sounder. Then he handed me the clipboard. Manifest. I scanned the sheet. 3 names. R. Peterson, contractor. J. Millard, ranger. A. Quan, mail courier. No vehicles. Estimated cargo weight 230 kilograms. Departure time 00:00. Arrival Kirkland Inlet 0230. Arrival Moss Harbor 0445. Return to Port Ahern 06:00. 3 passengers, I said. They'll board at 2358. You count them. You verify their names. If anyone else tries to board, you stop them. Understood. At 2357, I went down to the main deck and stood at the top of the gangway. The dock was quiet. A single overhead light buzzed near the operations building. Then I saw movement. 3 figures walking down from the parking area. 2 men and a woman. The first man wore a high-vis jacket and carried a toolbox. The second man wore a ranger uniform. The woman had a canvas bag slung over her shoulder. Evening, the man in the high-vis jacket said. Peterson. Calloway, you're on the manifest. He nodded and stepped aboard. The ranger followed. Millard, he said. On the manifest. The woman came last. Quan. On the manifest, welcome aboard. They moved past me into the passenger cabin. I waited 30 seconds, scanning the dock and the access road. No one else appeared. I checked my watch. 23:59. I pulled the gangway up and secured it, then moved to the bow and released the forward spring line. I coiled it and hung it on the cleat, then moved aft and released the stern line. The Nordling drifted 6 inches from the dock. I climbed back aboard and radioed the captain. Lines clear. Roger, stand by. The engines rumbled to life. I felt the deck vibrate beneath my boots. At exactly midnight, the Nordling eased away from the dock, her running lights cutting red and green across the black water. I went inside and climbed to the pilot house. Voss stood at the helm, his hands steady on the wheel. 3 passengers aboard, all verified, I said. Good. Check the cabin lights. I went back down. The cabin lights were on. All 3 passengers sat separately. Peterson near the bow, Millard midship, Quan near the galley. I counted them again. 3. I returned to the pilot house. Lights on. Count verified. Voss nodded. First radio check is at 00:30. Stay below until then. Keep the passengers in sight. Don't talk unless they ask you something directly. Understood. I spent the next 30 minutes moving through the cabin, checking the tie-downs, wiping down the galley counter, refilling the paper towel dispenser. The passengers ignored me. Peterson read a paperback with a cracked spine. Millard worked on a laptop. Quan stared out the window at the dark water. The ferry's engines thrummed at a steady pitch, and the deck rose and fell in a slow rhythm. 0030, I radioed the captain. First check. Roger, passenger count. 3. All accounted for. Lights? On. Good. Next check at 0100. I clipped the radio back to my belt and glanced at my watch. 12:31. I had 14 minutes until I needed to think about the cabin lights. I stood near the galley and watched the passengers. None of them moved. At 0044, I reached for the light switch near the galley entrance. My hand hesitated for a moment, then I flipped it down. The cabin went dark except for the faint glow from the running lights outside and the small emergency exit signs above the doors. Peterson looked up from his book, then pulled out a small flashlight and kept reading. Millard closed his laptop. Quan didn't move. I waited. The darkness felt heavier than it should have. I could hear the water slapping the hull and the low groan of the engines and the faint creak of the bench seats as Millard shifted his weight. My eyes adjusted slowly. I counted the passengers again by silhouette. 3. At 0100, I radioed the captain. Second check. Roger, count. 3. Lights off at 0045. Good. Stay alert. Next check at 0130. I moved to the starboard side and stood where I could see all 3 passengers and the restroom door. The restroom was a narrow space at the aft end of the cabin, just a toilet and a sink and a mirror. The door was closed. I checked my watch. 1:03. I had 7 minutes before the window opened. At 1:09, I watched Millard stand and stretch. He walked toward the restroom. I stepped forward. Sir, he paused. Yeah? Restroom's temporarily out of service. Should be available again in about 20 minutes. He frowned. It's broken? Precautionary plumbing issue, captain's orders. He stared at me for a moment, then shrugged and returned to his seat. I exhaled slowly and checked my watch again. 1:10. The next 20 minutes passed in silence. I stood near the galley and kept my eyes on the passengers and the restroom door. No one approached it. At 1:31, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease slightly. At 1:33, Quan stood and walked to the restroom. She opened the door, stepped inside, and closed it behind her. I heard the lock click. 2 minutes later, she emerged, returned to her seat, and resumed staring out the window. I radioed the captain. Third check. Roger, count. 3. Restroom window clear. Good. Next check at 0200. I glanced at my watch. 1:36. I had 24 minutes until the next count. I moved to the port side windows and looked out at the water. The surface was black and featureless except for the occasional white cap where the wind caught the chop. The mountains rose on both sides of the channel, darker shapes against the dark sky. No lights anywhere except our own. At 1:58, I moved to the center of the cabin and counted the passengers again. Peterson. Millard. Quan. 3. At 200, I radioed the captain. Fourth check. Conducting passenger count now. Roger. Report. I walked slowly through the cabin, making a show of checking the tie-downs and the emergency equipment. I counted as I moved. Peterson near the bow. Millard midship. Quan near the galley. 3. I keyed the radio. Count is 3. Matches manifest. Good. Hold position and wait. I stood near the galley and watched the passengers. None of them moved. 30 seconds passed. The radio crackled. Confirm you counted all visible passengers. Confirmed. 3 visible passengers. Check the forward storage closet. My pulse ticked up. I walked to the bow where a narrow storage closet held life jackets and emergency gear. The door was closed. I opened it slowly. The closet was empty except for the gear. I closed the door. Forward closet clear. Check behind the galley counter. I moved to the galley and leaned over the counter. Nothing. I walked around to the back. The space was narrow, just enough room for supplies. Empty. Galley clear. Check beneath the bench seats. I knelt and looked under the seats one by one, working from bow to stern. Nothing but shadows and the occasional dropped pen or candy wrapper. Seats clear. Good. Resume normal watch. Next check at 02:30. I stood and clipped the radio back to my belt. My hands were steady, but my breathing was shallow. The passengers hadn't reacted to my search. Peterson was still reading. Millard stared at his dark laptop screen. Quan watched the water. I checked my watch. 2:06. I had 9 minutes before the port side window. At 2:14, I moved to the starboard side of the cabin and stood with my back to the galley. I kept my eyes on the starboard windows and the passengers. I didn't look left. The ferry rocked slightly in the chop, and I heard the water rushing past the hull on both sides, but I kept my focus starboard. The minutes stretched. I counted my breaths. At 2:36, I allowed myself to turn and look at the port side. The windows showed only darkness and the running light's reflection. I radioed the captain. 5th check. Port window clear. Count as 3. Roger. Next check at 0300. I moved back to the galley and refilled the coffee urn. The fresh ground smelled sharp and ordinary. I poured myself half a cup and drank it standing up, watching the passengers. Peterson finally set his book down and closed his eyes. Millard opened his laptop again. Quan shifted in her seat but didn't look away from the window. At 0300, I radioed the captain. 6th check. Count as 3. Roger, stay sharp. We dock at Kirkland in 30 minutes. The crossing to Kirkland Inlet took us through a narrow channel between 2 steep islands. I could see the faint glow of the settlement's lights ahead. Maybe a dozen buildings on a rocky beach. At 0327, Peterson stood and gathered his toolbox. He moved to the starboard door and waited. I joined him. "First stop?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "You knew?" "First night." He nodded slowly. "Follow the rules and you'll be fine." That's what the captain said. He'd know. Peterson looked out at the approaching dock. Hendricks didn't listen. What happened to him? Peterson glanced at me. "You really want to know?" I hesitated. "Not sure." "Smart." He turned back to the window. "Just follow the rules." At 0330, we eased alongside the Kirkland dock. I went out on deck and caught the lines, securing them to the cleats. The loading ramp lowered with a hydraulic whine. Peterson walked off without looking back. I checked the manifest. Millard and Quan were continuing to Moss Harbor. I counted the passengers in the cabin. 2. I pulled the gangway up and released the lines. At 0338, we were underway again, the lights of Kirkland fading behind us. The next hour passed slowly. I moved through the cabin, checking the equipment, watching the passengers. Millard fell asleep with his head against the window. Quan remained awake, her eyes fixed on the black water. I radioed the captain every 30 minutes. The count stayed at 2. At 0400, I turned the cabin lights back on. The sudden brightness made me squint. Millard woke with a start and rubbed his eyes. Quan didn't react. I counted them both, then radioed the captain. 7th check. Lights on. Count as 2. Roger, final count in 10 minutes. At 0410, I walked through the cabin one more time, checking every space. 2 passengers, both accounted for. I radioed the report. Final count complete. 2 passengers, both verified. Good. We dock at Moss Harbor in 35 minutes. The crossing to Moss Harbor took us through open water where the fetch was longer and the ferry pitched more noticeably. I stood near the galley and held the counter for balance. At 0442, we approached the dock. Millard and Quan both stood and moved toward the door. I secured the lines and lowered the ramp. Both passengers walked off without speaking. I watched them disappear into the darkness beyond the dock lights, then pulled the ramp up and released the lines. At 0450 we were underway for the final leg back to Port Ahern. The cabin was empty. I walked through it slowly, checking every seat, every closet, every corner. Empty. I radioed the captain. Cabin clear, no passengers. Roger, stay below until we dock. The return crossing took 70 minutes. I spent the time cleaning the cabin, wiping down every surface, straightening the bench seats, emptying the trash. The work was meditative. My hands moved through familiar motions and my mind stayed quiet. At 0550 I felt the engines throttle back. I went out on deck and prepared the lines. The sky was still dark, but I could see a faint gray line on the eastern horizon. The Port Ahern dock lights appeared ahead. At 0600 we tied up. I secured the lines and coiled them properly, then walked up to the pilot house. Voss was shutting down the instruments. "Clean shift," he said. "No incidents." "Understood?" "You followed procedure." "Yes, sir." He turned and looked at me. "Most people break at least one rule the first night, curiosity or nerves. You didn't." "I need the job." "That's the right reason." He handed me the clipboard. "Log your hours and any notable observations. Leave it in the chart drawer. Next shift is 1900 tonight." "I'll be ready." I walked back to the bunkhouse as the sky brightened to a pale gray. The mountains were visible now, their peaks dusted with fresh snow. Inside, I logged my hours: 6 hours, 0 incidents, 3 passengers outbound, 2 continuing, 0 inbound. I added a note: all procedures followed, no anomalies observed. Then I counted my keys: 7. I hung them in the locker and climbed into my bunk. I slept until 1400. The second night began like the first. I met Voss on the dock at 1900 and we ran the walk-around. The manifest showed 4 passengers, 2 contractors, 1 supply driver, 1 name I didn't recognize. G. Thorne, no occupation listed. At 23:58 they boarded. I verified each name. The 2 contractors wore matching company jackets. The supply driver carried a clipboard. Thorne was a woman in her 30s wearing a dark jacket and a canvas backpack. She met my eyes when I checked her name. "First time on this route?" she asked. "Second night." "Interesting work?" "It's a job." She smiled slightly and moved into the cabin. At midnight we departed. I counted the passengers: 4. I checked the lights: on. At 0045 I turned them off. The darkness settled over the cabin like before. I stood near the galley and watched the silhouettes. 4 shapes. Then I heard something I hadn't heard the first night, a low rhythmic sound from somewhere below deck. Not the engines, not the water against the hull, something else. I keyed the radio. "Captain, hearing an unusual sound below deck, rhythmic, frequency about 1 per second. Location? Sounds like it's coming from the cargo hold. Time?" I checked my watch. 00:52. "Note it and continue normal watch. Do not investigate." Understood. The sound continued for another 3 minutes, then stopped. I noted the time: 00:55. I waited, listening. Nothing but the engines and the water. At 0100 I radioed the check. "Count is 4. Hold sound noted between 00:52 and 00:55. Roger, next check at 0130. At 0108 one of the contractors stood and walked toward the restroom. I intercepted him. "Sir, restrooms temporarily unavailable." "How long?" "About 22 minutes. "You serious?" "Yes, sir. Captain's orders." He stared at me, then shook his head and returned to his seat. I checked my watch. 1:09. I had 1 minute. At 1:10 I positioned myself where I could see the restroom door clearly. The ferry rocked slightly in the chop. I counted the passengers again. 4. At 1:23 Thorne stood and walked to the galley. She poured coffee from the urn and added powdered creamer. Then she turned and looked at me. "You're very attentive," she said. "Part of the job." What exactly are you watching for? Passenger safety, cargo security, standard operations. She sipped her coffee. Have you worked ferries long? This is my second night on this route. First week is always the hardest. She smiled again. You'll get used to it. I hope so. She returned to her seat. I checked my watch. 1:25, 6 minutes until the window closed. At 1:31, the tension in my shoulders eased. At 1:33, the supply driver stood and walked to the restroom. He emerged 2 minutes later and returned to his seat without incident. At 0200, I conducted the count. 4 passengers, all visible. I radioed the report. Count is 4. Matches manifest. Roger, hold position. I waited. 30 seconds passed. Check the forward closet. I walked to the bow and opened the closet. Life jackets and gear, nothing else. Forward closet clear. Check the galley. Galley clear. Check beneath the seats. I knelt and looked under each bench. Empty. Seats clear. Resume normal watch. At 2:15, I moved to the starboard side and kept my eyes away from the port windows. I counted my breaths again, focusing on the rhythm. The minutes passed slowly. At 2:36, I turned and faced forward. At 2:41, something changed. I was standing near the galley when I noticed Thorne was no longer in her seat. I scanned the cabin quickly. The 2 contractors sat near the bow. The supply driver sat midship. Thorne was gone. I moved through the cabin, checking every visible space. Not at the galley, not near the doors, not in the restroom. The door was open and the space was empty. I checked beneath the seats. Nothing. I keyed the radio, keeping my voice steady. Captain, passenger missing. Count is 3. Missing passenger is Thorne. When did you last visually confirm her? 2:38 approximately. Current time? 2:43. Start your search. Report every 60 seconds. I moved systematically through the cabin, checking every closet, every storage space, every corner. I looked behind the galley counter and under every bench. I checked the emergency equipment lockers. Nothing. 3 minutes elapsed. No contact. I moved to the doors and checked outside on deck. The wind was stronger now and spray misted across the railings. I walked the perimeter, checking the tie-down areas, the life raft housings, the spaces between cargo containers. Empty. 4 minutes elapsed. Deck clear. Check the forward hold access. I moved to the bow where a small hatch provided emergency access to the forward storage area. I opened it and shone my flashlight down. The space was crowded with rope coils and fenders. No person. I closed the hatch. Forward hold clear. Return to cabin. Continue search. I went back inside. The 3 remaining passengers hadn't moved. None of them had spoken or asked questions. I walked the cabin again, checking spaces I'd already checked. At 6 minutes, I stopped near the galley and keyed the radio. 6 minutes elapsed, no contact. Passenger Thorne not located. Note the time and last known position. Resume normal watch. Next check at 0300. I stood very still for a moment, my hand tight on the radio. Then I clipped it to my belt and pulled out my notebook. I wrote 0241, passenger G. Thorne. Last seen position, port side bench, 4th seat from bow. Not located, after 6-minute search. I put the notebook away and counted the remaining passengers. 3. At 0300, I radioed the check. Count is 3. Passenger Thorne remains unlocated. Roger, we dock at Kirkland in 30 minutes. Conduct final search before docking. At 0320, I walked through the cabin one more time. The 2 contractors were gathering their equipment. The supply driver was checking his manifest. I searched every space again. No Thorne. At 0330, we docked at Kirkland. The 2 contractors disembarked. I counted the remaining passengers. 1. I checked the manifest. The supply driver was continuing to Moss Harbor. I searched the cabin again while we were docked. Every closet, every space, every corner. Nothing. At 0338 we departed. At 0400 I turned the cabin lights on and conducted the final count. 1 passenger. I radioed the report. Final count complete. 1 passenger remaining. Thorn still unlocated. Roger. Continue to Moss Harbor. The supply driver disembarked at Moss Harbor without speaking. I searched the empty cabin one more time, then secured the vessel for the return to Port Ahern. At 0600 we tied up. I climbed to the pilot house. Voss was logging the shift. Report, he said. 3 passengers delivered. 1 passenger unaccounted for. Thorn. You followed procedure? Yes, sir. Timed search. Every space checked multiple times. He nodded. Anything else? Hold sound between 0052 and 0055. Rhythmic knocking. Noted. He closed the log. You followed the rules. That's what matters. What happened to her? He looked at me. Nothing good. But you can't prevent what you can't control. You did your job. Will there be an investigation? Coast Guard will be notified. They'll ask questions. You tell them exactly what you told me, nothing more. Understood. Next shift is tonight, 1900. I walked back to the bunkhouse and counted my keys. 7. I logged my hours and added a detailed note about Thorn's disappearance, including all times and search procedures. Then I lay on my bunk and stared at the ceiling until sleep came. The Coast Guard interviewed me at 1600, 2 officers in dress uniforms, polite and thorough. I gave them my statement, showed them my notes, answered every question. They thanked me and left. Voss told me later that Thorn's name wasn't in any passenger database. The manifest entry had no phone number, no emergency contact, no payment record. Happens sometimes, he said. People who shouldn't be here find their way aboard. The rules catch them. She seemed normal. That's how it works. On the 3rd night, I followed the same procedures. 4 passengers boarded, all verified. Lights on, then off at 0045. Restroom window from 1:10 to 1:30. Count at 200. Port window from 2:15 to 2:35. Lights on at 400. At 0118, I heard the knocking from the cargo hold again. Same rhythm, same frequency. I noted the time and radioed the captain. The knocking stopped at 0121. At 0200, I conducted the passenger count, 4 visible. I radioed the report and waited for the follow-up search order. It came within 30 seconds. I checked every space. All 4 passengers remained accounted for. At 0228, I was standing near the galley when I noticed something at the port window. A shape outside pressed against the glass, pale and indistinct. It moved slightly, tracking along the hull as the ferry cut through the water. I kept my eyes on the starboard side and counted my breaths. The shape didn't retry, continue, make any sound. I checked my watch. 2:29. I had 6 more minutes. At 2:35, I allowed myself to look at the port windows. The glass was dark and wet with spray. Nothing pressed against it. I keyed the radio. Port window period complete. No. Anomalies noted. Roger. Next check at 0300. The rest of the shift passed without incident. 4 passengers delivered, 0 lost. I logged my hours and noted the cargo hold knocking. 0118 to 0121. On the 4th night, I began to recognize patterns. The hold knocking always occurred between 0050 and 0125. The port side shape appeared 3 times out of 4 crossings, always between 2:20 and 2:32. The passengers who boarded after midnight and departed before 0330 were always real. The ones who boarded after 0300 never were. I kept detailed notes. Times, durations, frequencies, locations. I logged everything in a spiral notebook that I kept in my locker. Voss never asked to see it, but once when I was writing, he glanced at the page and nodded. Documentation is good practice, he said. Helps you spot changes. Have the rules changed since you've been captain? Twice. Once in 2007, once in 2014. What changed? The port window period used to be shorter, 0220 to 0230, then someone looked at 231 and spent the rest of the crossing bleeding from the eyes. We extended it to 235 after that. He checked the radar gain. The restroom window used to be 100 to 120. We had a passenger go in at 119 and the door wouldn't open again until we docked. Found her at 0615, changed. So we moved the window start to 110. Changed how? Wrong number of fingers, wrong side for her heart. Wouldn't speak in any language we recognized. He adjusted the throttle. Coast Guard took her. I don't know what happened after that. I made a note of it in my book that night. Window boundaries matter. 5-minute buffer saved someone's life. 10-minute buffer might not be enough. On the 7th night, I made my first mistake. The manifest showed 3 passengers, 2 contractors and a ranger. They boarded at 23:58 and I verified all 3 names. At midnight, we departed. At 00:45, I turned off the lights. At 0100, I radioed the check. Count was 3. At 01:15, one of the contractors stood and walked toward the restroom. I intercepted him and explained the temporary closure. He nodded and returned to his seat. At 01:33, the ranger stood and walked to the restroom. She opened the door, stepped inside, and closed it behind her. I was resetting my watch when I realized what I'd forgotten. I'd turned off the lights at 00:45, exactly on time. But I'd been distracted by the contractor asking about shore power specifications and I hadn't verified the light status afterward. I hadn't physically checked that the switch was down. I walked quickly to the galley and looked at the light switch near the entrance. It was down. Off. I checked the passenger cabin. Dark except for the exit signs, but I hadn't verified it at the time. I'd relied on my action, not on the result. I stood very still, breathing slowly. The ranger was still in the restroom. I could hear water running. I checked my watch. 1:34. She emerged at 1:36 and returned to her seat. She looked normal. Same uniform, same posture, same movements. I counted her fingers as she walked past. 10. Standard configuration. I exhaled slowly and keyed the radio. 3rd check. Count is 3. No anomalies. Roger. Next check at 0200. I spent the rest of the shift hyper-vigilant, checking every detail twice. Lights, count, windows, spaces, everything nominal. At 0600 we docked and I helped Voss with the shutdown. Clean shift? He asked. Yes, sir. Minor procedural lapse on my part, but no consequences observed. He looked at me. What lapse? Didn't physically verify the cabin light status after switching them off at 00:45. Corrected it immediately. But the lights were off. Yes, sir. And no consequences? No, sir. He nodded. That's a good catch. Most people wouldn't notice that kind of gap. You're developing the right instincts. Thank you, sir. Still, verify everything, action plus confirmation every time. Understood. That night I added a new entry to my notebook. Always verify state, not just action. The rule is about the outcome, not the procedure. On the 10th night I encountered my first passenger who violated Rule 10. The manifest showed 5 passengers. They boarded normally and I verified all 5 names. At midnight we departed. The shift proceeded routinely through the first 2 hours. Lights off at 00:45. Restroom window managed successfully. Count at 200 matched manifest. Port window from 2:15 to 2:35. At 03:12 we were 20 minutes out from Kirkland when one of the passengers stood and walked over to where I was checking the fire extinguisher mounts. He was a middle-aged man wearing a contractor jacket and work boots. His name on the manifest was D. Morrison. "Hey, Calloway," he said, "you got the time?" I stopped moving. My hand stayed on the extinguisher mount. I didn't turn around. "Approximately 0312, I said. I didn't look at him. "Thanks." He didn't move away. "How much longer to Kirkland?" 18 minutes. "Appreciate it." I heard his footsteps move back toward the seating area. I waited 30 seconds, then keyed the radio. "Captain." Passenger addressed me by first name, Passenger Morrison. "Current time?" 0313. "Describe the passenger." "Male, approximately 50, contractor jacket, work boots, brown hair, clean shaven, no visible marks or anomalies." "Did you acknowledge the name?" "No, sir." Responded to his question but did not confirm the name. "Good. Note his position. Do not interact further unless he initiates and uses deckhand or sir. Report any changes." "Understood." I moved to the starboard side where I could observe Morrison without being directly adjacent to him. He sat in his original seat near the galley. His posture was normal. He wasn't watching me. He pulled out a phone and scrolled through it. At 0330, we docked at Kirkland. Morrison was one of 3 passengers who disembarked. I watched him walk down the gangway and across the dock toward the parking area. He moved normally, got into a white pickup truck, drove away. I searched the cabin after he departed. Found nothing unusual in his seating area. No marks, no objects, no residue. At 0600, I reported to Voss. Morrison departed at Kirkland without further incident. "You handled it correctly. The name test is common. They're checking if you'll acknowledge." "What happens if I do?" "Depends. Sometimes nothing. Sometimes you end up like Hendricks." "What happened to Hendricks?" Voss closed the log. "He acknowledged his name 3 times in one shift. 4th time, someone called to him from outside the cabin while we were underway. He opened the door to answer. Took us 40 minutes to find him in the water. He was alive, but he kept saying his name wasn't Hendricks anymore. It was something else, something we couldn't pronounce. Wouldn't let us call him anything. Quit the next day." I filed that information carefully. Acknowledging your name creates a binding. 3 times weakens your anchor, 4 times and you're not yourself anymore. On the 14th night, we picked up a passenger who changed everything. The manifest showed 4 names. At 23:58, 4 people boarded. I verified them one by one. The last passenger was a young woman, maybe 25, wearing a heavy canvas jacket and carrying a notebook. Her name on the manifest was S. Chen. "Evening," she said as I checked her name. "Evening, you're verified." She paused at the threshold. "Is Voss still the captain?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Tell him Chen from the inlet says the count's off at the marker." "I'll relay that." She nodded and moved into the cabin. At midnight, we departed. I ran through the standard procedures: lights, count, windows, restroom, everything nominal. At 0300, I passed Chen's message to Voss over the radio. "Captain, passenger Chen asked me to relay. Count's off at the marker." There was a longer pause than usual, then, "Copy that. When did she board?" 23:58. She's manifested for Kirkland." "Understood. After she disembarks, meet me on the aft deck. Don't delay." "Yes, sir." At 0330, we docked at Kirkland. Chen was the only passenger departing. She walked down the gangway, stopped at the bottom, and turned back to look at the ferry. She met my eyes for a moment, then walked away into the darkness. I secured the vessel and went to the aft deck. Voss was already there, standing at the stern rail. I joined him. "Chen works for the inlet station," he said. "Scientific monitoring. She knows the route and she knows the rules. If she says the count's off at the marker, something's changed." "What marker?" "Mile marker 7. It's where the channel narrows between Kirkland and Moss Harbor. There's a navigation buoy there, green lit standard marker. But it's also a threshold. Something watches from that point. We've always counted 4 of them. Chen's saying there's a different number now." "4 of what?" We don't name them. Names create handles. He pulled out a small notebook and clicked a pen. I need to update the procedures. Starting tomorrow night, we add 2 rules, Rule 13 and Rule 14. He wrote in careful block letters. 13. At mile marker 7, conduct a silent count. Observe the water surrounding the green buoy. Count the disturbances. Do not count aloud. Do not point. If you count 5 or more, radio the captain immediately using code phrase navigation check required. You count 3 or fewer. Continue normal operations and report at next scheduled check. 14. If code phrase navigation check required is used, reduce speed to 4 knots. The captain will take manual control. Do not look directly at the marker buoy until instructed. Keep your eyes on the instruments or the forward horizon. He tore the page from the notebook and handed it to me. Memorize these. We'll add them to the briefing sheet. First time through tomorrow, I'll handle it. After that, you need to know the count. Understood. What's the right count? 4. Always been 4. Chen saying it's off means something's changed. 5 means they're expanding. 3 means one's hunting. And either way we slow down. 5 or more, we slow down because we're crossing their territory and we need to show respect. We don't own that passage, we're just permitted through it. 3 or fewer, we're already in danger and speed doesn't matter. So we maintain course and hope they're not interested tonight. He took the paper back and folded it carefully. Questions? How do I recognize the disturbances? You'll know. They're not waves, not seals, not floating debris. You'll look at the water and your brain will try to tell you there's nothing there, but you'll count them anyway. Don't fight the count. Just observe and report. What if I count 4? Then everything's normal and you don't need to report it until the next scheduled check. 4 is baseline. I nodded. Anything else I should know? After you count, don't try to remember what they looked like. Don't describe them in your notes, just log the number and move on. Holding the image makes you visible to them. Understood? He turned back toward the pilot house. We've got 40 minutes to Moss Harbor. Get back to the cabin and finish the shift normally. Tomorrow night, we'll run the count together. The rest of the shift was routine. 2 passengers to Moss Harbor, empty cabin on the return. At 0600, I logged my hours and added 2 entries to my notebook. Rule 13, silent count at marker 7. Rule 14, speed reduction protocol. Baseline count is 4. Do not visualize, do not describe. Then I counted my keys. 7. I locked them in the locker and tried to sleep. On the 15th night, the manifest showed 6 passengers. They boarded normally. At midnight, we departed. The shift proceeded through the standard procedures without incident. At 0330, we departed Kirkland with 3 passengers continuing to Moss Harbor. At 0352, Voss radioed me. Come to the pilot house. Bring the binoculars from the emergency locker. I retrieved the binoculars and climbed to the helm. Voss was standing at the wheel, his eyes on the forward horizon. The radar screen showed the channel narrowing ahead. Mile marker 7 in 3 minutes, he said. Stand to my left. Don't use the binoculars yet. I'll tell you when to look. I took my position. The ferry's engines thrummed steadily. The water ahead was black and calm. The chop from earlier in the crossing had settled. I could see the green navigation light blinking in the distance. 2 minutes, Voss said. Remember, observe, count, don't describe. If you feel your brain trying to rationalize what you're seeing, let it go. Just count. Understood. 1 minute. Start looking now. Focus on the water within 30 meters of the buoy. I looked. At first I saw nothing but the dark water and the blinking green light. Then my eyes began to register disturbances, not waves, not the buoy's reflection, something else. Shapes that interrupted the surface tension without breaking it. Absences that somehow had presence. I counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I counted again slower. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5, I said quietly. Voss nodded and pulled the throttle back. The engines dropped to a low thrum and the ferry slowed. Mark it. Code phrase. I keyed the radio. Navigation check required. Roger, speed reduced. Maintain watch until we pass the marker. We slid past the green buoy at 4 knots. The disturbances moved slightly, tracking along our course but not approaching. I counted them again. Still 5. Then we were past the marker and Voss pushed the throttle forward. The engines resumed their normal pitch. Clear, he said. They're expanding their range. That's the second confirmation in 3 days. I'll need to report this to operations. What happens now? We note it. Operations will notify the inlet station. Chen and her team will do surveys. If the count stays at 5 for more than a week, we might need to adjust the route. Adjust how? Wider arc through the channel. Adds 7 minutes to the crossing. Costs fuel, but it keeps us out of their core territory. He logged the count in his notebook. Good work. You counted clean. Some people freeze the first time and can't get a number. They're hard to look at. That's the point. They don't want to be counted, but we need to know how many there are. He checked the radar. 15 minutes to Moss Harbor. Resume normal watch. I went back down to the cabin. The 3 passengers were asleep or nearly asleep. I counted them anyway. 3. I checked every space. All clear. At 0400, I turned on the lights and conducted the final count. 3. At 0600, I logged the shift, including the marker count. Voss countersigned the entry. On the 16th night, the count at the marker was 4, baseline. On the 17th night, it was 6. Voss slowed the ferry to 3 knots and we crept past the marker with the disturbances tracking alongside, 5 meters off the port rail. I could feel their attention on the hull. Not hostile, not benign, just aware. After we passed, Voss radioed operations. I listened to his side of the conversation. Clipped, precise, no wasted words. Operations acknowledged and told him the route adjustment would be implemented starting on the 21st. 4 days, Voss said when he ended the call. Until then, we keep the count and slow down when needed. If it goes above 7, we abort the crossing and return to port. Has it ever gone above 7? Once, 2009. March. It went to 9. We turned around. They followed us for 2 miles before dropping off. We waited until dawn and ran the crossing in daylight. Count was back to 4. What happened to the passengers? Refunded their fares. Most of them never came back. On the 18th night, the count was 5. On the 19th, 7. Voss slowed to 2 knots and we ghosted past the marker with the disturbances forming a loose perimeter around the buoy. They didn't approach, but I could feel the weight of them pressing against the edge of my vision. On the 20th night, the count was back to 4. They're settling, Voss said, establishing new territory limits. Tomorrow we start the wider arc. It'll add time, but the count should stabilize. On the 21st night, we ran the new route. The arc took us 200 meters further from the marker buoy. I could still see the green light blinking in the distance, but we didn't pass close enough to count. The crossing took 7 minutes longer and we arrived at Moss Harbor at 04:52 instead of 04:45. The count stabilized at 4 on the new route. Chen boarded again on the 24th night and nodded when I told her. Good, she said. Means they're adapting to the boundary change. Keep monitoring. I was 3 weeks into the job and my notebook had 40 pages of logs. Times, counts, durations, locations, anomalies, rule violations, consequences. I read through it every morning after shift looking for patterns. Some emerged clearly. The hold knocking always occurred in the first 90 minutes. The portside shape appeared most often between 02:20 and 02:32. Passengers who used first names always boarded in the second half of the month. Other patterns were subtler. I noticed that incidents clustered around the new moon. I noticed that on nights when the temperature dropped below freezing, the restroom window extended by 2 minutes without any formal rule change. I noticed that when we carried more than 6 passengers, the probability of a Rule 10 violation increased by roughly 40%. I mentioned some of these patterns to Voss. He listened and nodded. "You're developing the model," he said. "That's good. The rules are the framework, but the model is what keeps you alive when something falls outside the rules." "Has anything ever fallen outside the rules?" "Twice. Once in 2006, once in 2019. "What happened?" 2006, we had a passenger manifest herself 3 times. Same name, same seat, 3 consecutive crossings. But only one body. The other 2 were echoes. Couldn't tell which was real. Rules didn't cover it because the rules assume 1 body per manifest entry. We radioed operations and they told us to treat all 3 as real until they diverged. They never did. All 3 disembarked at Moss Harbor and walked in different directions. And 2019? Fire in the cargo hold, not a normal fire, started at 00:53, right when the knocking usually begins. Rules don't cover fire suppression during operational hours. We had to choose. Follow the rules and let it burn, or break containment and fight it. I chose to fight it. What happened? We put it out, but the hold door was open for 4 minutes. During the port side window, something got in. We found it in the life raft housing at 05:30. It was small, maybe the size of a cat, but wrong geometry. Too many joints. We didn't have a rule for disposal, so I radioed operations and they walked me through a new protocol. Containment, salt barrier, wait for daylight, transfer to inlet station for study. Did it survive? Don't know. Inlet station, confirmed receipt but never reported results. Chen says they have a cold storage unit for anomalies, but she's not authorized to access it. He checked the radar. Point is, the rules are good, but they're not exhaustive. When you encounter something outside the framework, use the principles. Containment, documentation, consultation, verification. Don't improvise unless you have no choice. I added that to my notebook. Principles when rules don't apply. Contain, document, consult, verify. On the 28th night, I encountered my first Rule 11 situation. The manifest showed 5 passengers. Standard crossing through 0330. We departed Kirkland with 2 passengers continuing to Moss Harbor. At 0348, I was conducting a routine walkthrough when I noticed someone on the aft deck. They were standing at the stern rail facing the wake. Tall figure, dark clothing, hands on the rail. Completely still. I checked my watch. 0349. Inside the 1 to 5 window. I stopped walking and keyed the radio. Captain, individual on aft deck facing stern. 0349. Describe clothing. Dark jacket, dark pants, no visible hat. Can't see the face from this angle. Approach from port side and look for distinguishing marks. Do not speak. Do not get within 3 meters. Report back. I moved carefully through the starboard door and along the port rail. The wind was strong and spray misted across the deck. I approached the figure from an angle, keeping 3 meters of distance. Dark jacket, dark pants, work boots. The jacket had a patch on the left shoulder, but I couldn't read it from this angle. The figure didn't move. Didn't turn. Hands gripped the rail with normal pressure. I moved slightly closer, trying to see the patch. White stitching on dark fabric. Letters. I squinted. The letters weren't in any alphabet I recognized. I stopped walking and keyed the radio. Jacket patch has non-standard lettering. Can't identify language or symbols. Figure remains stationary. Copy. Hold position. Do not approach further. I'm coming down. Voss appeared 2 minutes later from the pilot house stairs. He moved along the starboard rail and stopped next to me, keeping the same 3-meter distance. He studied the figure for 30 seconds without speaking. Then he pulled out his notebook and made a quick sketch of the jacket patch. He showed it to me. The symbols looked similar to what I'd seen, but somehow flattened, less dimensional. "Confirm this matches?" he asked quietly. "Close. The actual patch has more depth to it, like the letters are layered." He nodded and tucked the notebook away. "We wait. Don't talk. Don't approach. If it moves toward us, we move to maintain distance. If it goes below deck, we follow at distance and radio for emergency protocols. If it's still here at 0500, we'll try verbal contact according to the amended procedures." "There are amended procedures for this?" "Rule 11 has sub-clauses. I'll brief you after shift." We stood on the deck for 43 minutes. The figure never moved, didn't shift weight, didn't adjust grip, didn't turn. The wind picked up and spray soaked both of us, but the figure's clothing didn't seem to get wet. At 0432, the ferry began its turn toward Moss Harbor, and the figure's position relative to the stern changed. But it didn't compensate. It stayed locked to its original orientation, which meant it was now facing slightly port of the wake. At 0500 exactly, Voss stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was steady and formal. "You're in a restricted area. Please return to the passenger cabin." The figure didn't respond. "Sir or ma'am, I'm the captain of this vessel. You need to move to the passenger cabin immediately." Nothing. Voss waited 30 seconds, then keyed his radio. "Operations, this is Nordling. Request emergency protocol authentication for Rule 11 Subclause C." The radio crackled. "Authentication confirmed. Proceed with protocol." Voss pulled a small red cloth from his pocket. He approached the figure slowly, keeping his movements smooth and predictable. At 2 meters, he stopped. "By authority of the vessel, Captain, and in accordance with maritime operational procedures, I'm marking you for observation and potential removal." He held up the red cloth. "If you're a passenger of this vessel, identify yourself now. If you're not a passenger, you need to leave." The figure remained motionless for 5 seconds. Then it turned. The face was wrong. Not grotesque, not inhuman, but assembled slightly incorrectly. Eyes that didn't quite track together. Mouth that sat a few millimeters too high. Ears that were mirror reversed. It looked at Voss, then at me, then back at Voss. "Passenger," it said. The voice was flat and came from the wrong place, like it originated behind us and reflected forward. "Name and manifest number." "J. Torrens, 7. Voss kept the red cloth raised. "There's no manifest number 7 tonight. Highest number is 5. The figure tilted its head. "7. "Show me your ticket." It reached into its jacket pocket. The movement was fluid but somehow reversed, like watching a mirror image of someone reaching into a pocket. It pulled out a slip of paper and held it toward Voss. He took the paper carefully, not letting his fingers touch the figure's hand. He glanced at it, then held it so I could see. Standard ferry ticket printed on regulation stock. Date correct. Route correct. Name, J. Torrens. Manifest number 7. But there were only 5 manifest numbers tonight. I checked them myself. Voss folded the ticket and put it in his pocket. "This ticket isn't valid for tonight's crossing. You'll need to disembark at Moss Harbor." "Moss Harbor," the figure said. "Yes." "Until then, you need to go to the passenger cabin and stay there. Do you understand?" "Cabin. Yes." It turned and walked toward the cabin door. The gait was almost normal, but the rhythm was slightly off, like each step came a fraction of a second late. It opened the door and went inside. Voss and I stood on the deck for another minute. Then he keyed the radio. "Operations Rule 11 Subclause C completed. Entity complied with verbal direction. Marked for removal at next port. Copy. Monitor until disembark. Report any changes." Voss turned to me. "Stay on the aft deck. Watch the cabin door. If it comes back out before we dock, radio immediately. Don't interact with it. Understood. What was the red cloth? Marker. Old protocol. Red means observed and catalogued. Most of them recognize it and cooperate. This one did, so we're probably fine. But watch it until it's off the boat. He went back to the pilot house. I stayed on the aft deck watching the cabin door through the window. Inside, I could see the two manifest passengers sleeping in their seats. The figure, Torrens, sat near the sternside door, perfectly still. At 04:45, we approached Moss Harbor. At 04:52, we docked. The two manifest passengers disembarked first. Then Torrens stood and walked down the gangway. It moved across the dock with that same delayed gait and disappeared into the darkness beyond the lights. I searched the cabin after it left, found the seat where it had been sitting. The bench was cold to the touch, colder than it should have been. No other marks or residue. At 0600, Voss briefed me on Rule 11 subclauses. Subclause A. If the figure moves toward you or another passenger, retreat and radio for emergency extraction. We abort the crossing. Subclause B. If the figure speaks first before you address it, do not respond. Maintain distance and radio for assessment. Subclause C. If the figure doesn't move or speak until you initiate contact, you can use verbal direction and the red marker. Most of them will comply because they're trying to pass as normal passengers. The ticket it showed you was real in its frame of reference. Doesn't match ours, but real to it. Subclause D. If multiple figures appear simultaneously, do not engage. Radio immediately and we return to port. He pulled out the ticket and set it on the chart table. Under the pilot house lights, I could see it more clearly. The print was sharp and the paper stock was correct, but something about the ink seemed to catch the light wrong, like it was slightly out of phase with the surface it was printed on. Operations will want this for analysis, Voss said. They collect these. Chen says they have about 40 tickets in storage, all with manifest numbers that don't match the actual crossings. What are they? Echoes, maybe. Reflections. Something that exists in overlap with our route but not quite synchronized. They board because from their perspective they're supposed to be on the ferry. The rules catch them because they can't perfectly match our timeline. He folded the ticket and put it in an envelope. You handled that well. Stayed calm, maintained distance, followed the protocol. Most people panic the first time. I was scared. Good. Fear keeps you careful. It's panic that gets you killed. I logged the incident in my notebook, 0349 to 0452. Rule 11 entity. Subclause C protocol successful. Ticket collected. Cold residue on seating. I'd been on the job for 4 weeks and I'd already encountered disappearances, impossible passengers, territorial water entities, and timeline echoes. My debt was shrinking with each paycheck, but I was starting to understand what I was paying for it. On the 30th night, operations updated the procedures again. Voss handed me a new sheet at the briefing. Amendment list. 8 new rules effective immediately. Read them now. I unfolded the paper. The amendments were typed in the same font as the original 12 rules. Amendment 1. If you smell copper or ozone in the passenger cabin between midnight and 04 Tuluares, open all windows and doors for exactly 90 seconds, then close and seal them. Do not investigate the source of the smell. Report it at the next scheduled radio check. Amendment 2. If a passenger boards with more than 2 pieces of luggage and the combined weight exceeds 90 kilograms, verify the contents before departure. If the passenger refuses inspection, they do not board. If they insist, radio the captain immediately. Amendment 3. Between 01:45 and 02:05, do not respond to any passenger requests that involve going below deck or accessing storage areas. Tell them you'll handle the request after 02:05 and note the request in your log. Amendment 4. If you see condensation forming on the inside of windows in a pattern that resembles writing, wipe it clean immediately. Do not attempt to read it. If it reforms within 60 seconds, photograph it, send it to the captain, and wipe it clean again. Amendment 5. If the engines stutter or lose power between 3:00 and 04:00, radio the captain using code phrase propulsion check required and note the exact time. Do not attempt to investigate or adjust anything in the engine room. Amendment 6. If you find any object on deck or in the cabin that you do not recognize and that is not on the cargo manifest, do not touch it. Mark its position with chalk or tape, photograph it, and report it to the captain. If it moves between checks, update the position mark and photograph again. Amendment 7. If a passenger sneezes, coughs, or vomits more than 7 times in a 5-minute period, observe them carefully. If their eyes are bloodshot or if they speak in a language different from what they used when boarding, isolate them in the forward storage area and radio for medical assessment protocols. Amendment 8. Between 04:30 and 05:30, if you hear music or singing that is not coming from any passenger or device, do not try to locate the source. Note the time, duration, and approximate direction. Report it at the next scheduled check. If it continues for more than 4 minutes, radio the captain immediately using code phrase audio anomaly confirmed. I read through them twice. These are very specific. Each one responds to an incident from the last 5 years, Voss said. Amendment 1. 2021 passenger collapsed from unknown gas exposure. Amendment 2. 2022 cargo contained biological specimens that weren't properly sealed. Amendments 3 through 8 all came from incidents in 2023 and 24. What happened in those years? Frequency increased. We don't know why. Chen's team has theories about tidal cycles and mineral deposits, but nothing confirmed. Point is, the rules adapt to what we learn. You need to memorize these tonight. I spent the next hour before departure internalizing the amendments. By midnight, I could recite all 8 from memory. The crossing started normally. 4 passengers boarded, all verified. Lights on, then off, at 00:45. Count at 200 matched manifest. At 02:53, I was standing near the galley when I smelled it. Sharp, metallic, like electrical discharge mixed with fresh blood. Copper and ozone. I checked my watch. 02:54, Amendment 1. I moved quickly to the cabin windows and opened them one by one, then opened both doors. Cold wind poured through the space and the passengers stirred but didn't wake. I counted 90 seconds exactly, watching my watch. At 02:55 and 30 seconds, I closed the doors. At 02:56, I closed the windows. The smell was gone. I keyed the radio. Amendment 1 protocol completed. 02:54 to 02:56, smell cleared. Copy, note it, and continue normal watch. At 0300, I radioed the count. 4 passengers, all accounted for, smell resolved, no other anomalies. The rest of the shift was routine. At 0600, I logged the amendment usage and V retry B continue OSS countersigned it. Good timing on that one, he said. If you wait too long, the smell builds up and passengers start having nosebleeds. We lost 1 person that way in 21 before we figured out the ventilation protocol. What causes it? Don't know. Something about the air pressure or the water chemistry at certain points in the crossing. Doesn't happen every night, but when it does, the 90-second ventilation clears it. On the 32nd night, I encountered Amendment 4. At 00:58, I was checking the port windows when I noticed condensation forming on the glass. The cabin was warm and the outside air was cold, so condensation wasn't unusual. But this wasn't random droplets. This was forming in lines. Letters. I grabbed a rag from the galley and wiped the window clean immediately, not letting my eyes focus on the words. The glass cleared. I waited, watching. 60 seconds passed. The condensation began forming again. Same window, same pattern. I pulled out my phone and took 3 photos from different angles, keeping my eyes slightly unfocused so I wouldn't read the message. Then I wiped the window clean again and radioed the captain. Amendment 4 protocol. Condensation writing on port window 3. Photographs taken, sending now. I transmitted the photos over the encrypted channel we used for documentation. Voss's response came 30 seconds later. Received. Good work not reading it. Wipe it again if it reforms. I'll forward to operations. The condensation formed a third time, but more faintly. I wiped it clean. After that, it didn't return. At 0600, Voss showed me his phone. He'd enhanced one of the photos. The letters were clearer now, written in condensation on the glass. 7 under the marker now. Chen will want to see this, Voss said. Confirms the count's still unstable. We're running the wider arc, but they're still expanding. Should we be worried? We're always worried. But operations says the pattern is consistent with territorial negotiation. They push, we adjust, eventually it stabilizes. Been happening for decades. He deleted the photo. But we keep counting and we keep documenting. On the 36th night, we had 6 passengers. The crossing proceeded normally through the first 3 hours. At 03:14, 22 minutes out from Kirkland, one of the passengers, a contractor named Sullivan, started coughing. I watched from the galley. He coughed 4 times in quick succession, then stopped. Normal enough. Winter weather, dry air in the cabin, then he coughed again. 3 more times. 7 total. I checked my watch and started a mental timer, 5 minutes. I needed to track this carefully. Sullivan coughed again at 03:15, 2 more, 9 total within 90 seconds. I moved closer, staying out of direct line of sight. His eyes were watering, but I couldn't see the color clearly in the dim cabin light. At 03:16, he coughed 5 more times in rapid succession, 14 total. Still inside the 5-minute window, I keyed the radio quietly. Captain, passenger Sullivan. 14 coughs in 2 minutes, monitoring for Amendment 7 threshold. Copy. Stay alert. At 03:17, Sullivan stopped coughing. He wiped his face with his sleeve and settled back in his seat. I waited. The 5-minute window closed at 03:19. No more coughing. Total count, 14, but spread over 4 minutes. Amendment 7 required more than 7 in 5 minutes. I radioed the captain. Sullivan count was 14 over 4 minutes, does not meet Amendment 7 threshold. Monitoring continues. Copy. Noted. At 03:30, we docked at Kirkland. Sullivan disembarked with 2 other passengers. He walked normally down the gangway. I watched him cross the dock and climb into a company truck. No signs of distress. I logged it anyway. Sullivan, contractor. 14 coughs, 4 minutes below threshold. Normal disembarkation. On the 39th night, I encountered Amendment 6. At 01:43, I was conducting a routine cabin check when I found something on the floor near the starboard door. A small object. Maybe 5 centimeters long, dark metal or possibly stone. I'd walked this route 6 times already this shift and hadn't seen it before. I didn't touch it. I pulled out my phone and took 4 photos from different angles. Then I found a piece of white tape in the galley and placed markers on the floor outlining the object's position. I keyed the radio. Amendment 6 protocol. Unidentified object, starboard door, deck level, photographed and marked. Sending documentation now. I transmitted the photos. Voss responded within a minute. Received. Description. Dark material, possibly metal or stone, 5 centimeters long, irregular shape. Not on cargo manifest, wasn't present during previous checks. Good. Monitor it. If it moves, update the markers and photograph again. Don't touch it under any circumstances. I conducted my next check at 02:15. The object was still there, still in the same position relative to my tape markers. I photographed it again to confirm. At 02:45, I checked again. The object had moved. It was now 15 centimeters closer to the cabin interior, no longer touching my original tape marks. I placed new markers, photographed it, and radioed the captain. Object has moved 15 centimeters toward cabin interior. New position marked and photographed. Copy, continue monitoring. If it moves again, I'm coming down. At 03:15, I checked again. The object was gone. My tape markers were still on the floor, but the space between them was empty. I searched the immediate area. Nothing. I checked under the nearby seats. Nothing. I photographed the empty space where it had been and radioed the report. Object no longer present. Search of immediate area negative. Markers remain in place. Understood. Collect the markers and continue normal watch. I'll flag it for operations. At 0600, Voss showed me the photos on his computer, zoomed in. The object looked like a piece of carved stone or possibly bone, with markings that might have been deliberate or might have been natural texture. Impossible to tell from the images. We see these maybe once every 6 weeks, Voss said. They appear, move, disappear. Never found one that stayed long enough to analyze. Chen's team thinks they're test objects, something checking our response patterns. Test objects from what? From whatever's out here with us. He closed the file. But they haven't hurt anyone and they don't interfere with operations, so we just document them and move on. On the 42nd night, I heard the singing. At 04:48, I was preparing for the final approach to Moss Harbor when I heard it. A voice, distant but clear, singing something without words. Just tones rising and falling in a pattern that almost made sense but never quite resolved. It seemed to come from somewhere forward, maybe the bow area. I checked the cabin. 2 passengers, both asleep. Neither was making any sound. I checked my watch. 04:49. Inside the window for Amendment 8, I keyed the radio. Audio anomaly, 04:49. Singing, no words, source uncertain, direction approximately forward. Duration 30 seconds so far. Copy. Do not investigate, monitor duration. The singing continued. I timed it carefully, counting seconds. At 3 minutes 50 seconds it stopped. I waited. It didn't resume. Audio anomaly ended. Total duration 3 minutes 50 seconds, no recurrence. Copy. Note it and continue. At 0600, I logged the incident. Voss added a note. Pattern consistent with previous reports. Duration under 4 minutes, no intervention required. The work fell into a rhythm after that. 43 crossings became 50, then 60, then 75. I learned the patterns, internalized the rules, developed instincts for what was normal and what required attention. My debt shrank steadily. My notebook filled with observations. Some nights were routine. Passengers boarding and disembarking normally. Rules followed precisely. No anomalies beyond the expected baseline. Other nights brought Rule 11 entities or amendment protocols or new variations that required documentation and consultation. On the 68th night, a passenger manifested twice. Different seats, different clothing, same name and face. I counted 6 passengers, but only 5 names on the manifest. I radioed the captain and we worked through the protocol. Observe both, note differences, do not engage unless they engage each other. They sat separately, never acknowledged each other, both disembarked at Kirkland without incident. On the 79th night, the engines stuttered at 03:32. I radioed the code phrase immediately. Propulsion check required. Voss ran diagnostics from the pilot house. The engines stabilized within 90 seconds. We logged it as a minor fuel system fluctuation, but the timing was exact to Amendment 5's window. On the 83rd night, I found condensation writing on 3 windows simultaneously. I photographed all 3 before wiping them clean. The messages were different on each window. Voss forwarded them to operations. Chen responded 2 days later. The messages were counting sequences in 3 different number systems. She said it confirmed that whatever was communicating through the condensation had mathematical awareness. On the 91st night, the count at mile marker 7 was 8. Voss slowed the ferry to 1 knot, and we barely ghosted past the marker. The disturbances formed a complete circle around the buoy, tight and symmetrical. I counted them 3 times, always 8. After we passed, Voss radioed operations and they authorized another route adjustment. 23 meters further from the marker, adding 4 more minutes to the crossing. The adjustments worked. The count stabilized at 4 again after 3 nights on the new route. On the 103rd night, Chen boarded with equipment. "Observation run," she explained when I checked her manifest. "I'll be taking measurements during the crossing. Don't worry, I know the rules." She set up a laptop and 3 sensors near the galley. At midnight, we departed. She worked quietly, logging data, making notes. At 00:53, when the hold knocking started, she checked her sensors and nodded. At 02:20, when the port side shape appeared, she took readings but didn't look directly at the water. At 0400, when I turned the cabin lights back on, she packed up her equipment and came over to where I was standing. "You're good at this," she said. "Voss says you haven't missed a rule yet. I follow procedures. It's more than that. You understand the system. Most people just memorize and execute. You're building a model." Captain Voss said the same thing. He would know. She glanced at her equipment. "The data I'm collecting tonight confirms something we've suspected. The phenomena are getting more organized, more patterned. The baseline's shifting." "Toward what?" "We don't know yet, but whatever's out here, it's learning our procedures the same way you're learning its patterns. We adjust, it adjusts, back and forth." She zipped her equipment bag. "That's why the rules keep changing. We're not just following safety protocols, we're negotiating boundaries with something that operates on principles we barely understand." "Is that dangerous?" "It's dangerous if we stop paying attention, if we get complacent. But as long as we stay alert and keep documenting, we can maintain the equilibrium." She paused. "The fact that you've made it to 100 shifts means you understand that. Most people quit by 30. At 03:30, she disembarked at Kirkland. Before she left, she handed me a small notebook. "Extra one from my kit. Your notes are good. Keep doing what you're doing." I thanked her and tucked the notebook into my pocket. On the 110th night, operations transmitted a new rule. Voss called me to the pilot house before the shift started and handed me a printed sheet. "Rule 15, effective immediately, read it." 15. If you see the same passenger on 3 consecutive crossings and they sit in the same seat each time, and they wear the same clothing each time, note their name on the 4th crossing. If they board a 4th time matching the same pattern, they do not board. Remove them from the gangway and radio the captain immediately. "This is new," I said. "Happened last month on the day shift. Passenger named Rourke boarded 14 consecutive crossings. Same seat, same clothes, same arrival time. On the 15th crossing, he stood up mid-route and walked straight through the cabin wall. Left a mark. We had to replace the panel." Voss took the paper back. Operations reviewed the logs and realized he'd been showing the same ticket every time. Same date, same manifest number, physical ticket, not a new printout. Impossible unless time was looping for him somehow. "So now we catch them at 4? 4 is the threshold. 3 could be coincidence or routine. 4 is pattern confirmation. If they make it to 4, they're locked into something and we can't have them on the vessel." I memorized the rule. That night I started tracking passenger patterns more carefully, noting who sat where and what they wore. My notebook gained new columns: name, seat, clothing, crossing count. On the 118th night, I identified my first Rule 15 case, a passenger named Delacroix. I'd seen him on 3 previous crossings, nights 112, 114, and 116. Each time he wore a dark blue jacket and sat in the port side bench, third seat from the bow. Each time he departed at Moss Harbor. On night 118, he showed up at the gangway at 23:57. Dark blue jacket. Manifest showed him assigned to the port side bench, third seat from the bow. Destination? Moss Harbor. I checked my notebook. Pattern confirmed. "Sir," I said, "I need to verify some information. Can I see your ticket?" He handed it over. I examined it under the dock lights. The date was current. The manifest number matched. But when I tilted it, the ink seemed to shimmer slightly, the same phase shift quality I'd seen on the Rule 11 ticket months ago. "Sir, I'm sorry, but you can't board tonight," he frowned. "Why not? My ticket's valid." "There's a procedural issue. You'll need to contact operations to resolve it." "What kind of procedural issue?" "I'm not authorized to discuss it. Operations contact is on the ticket stub." I handed the ticket back. "I apologize for the inconvenience." He stared at me for a long moment. His expression didn't change, but something about his posture shifted, like he was recalibrating. Then he nodded once and walked back up the dock toward the parking area. I watched him until he disappeared, then keyed the radio. "Captain, Rule 15 protocol completed. Passenger Delacroix removed from boarding. Pattern confirmed over 4 crossings. Good work. Operations will follow up. Continue with departure procedures." At midnight, we departed with 4 passengers, all verified and all new to my tracking logs. On the 125th night, Voss pulled me aside during the pre-shift briefing. "You've been on the job for 4 months, he said. "That puts you in the top 15% for retention on this route. Operations wants to know if you're planning to stay through the winter." "I'm planning to stay." "Good, because I need to start training you on relief captain procedures. When the weather gets bad in January and February, there are nights when I can't make the crossing. Ice, storm surge, 0 visibility. On those nights, if we're running at all, the deckhand takes the helm. I've never captained a ferry. You'll learn. It's mostly about following procedures, which you're already good at. The difference is you'll be responsible for the whole vessel, not just the cabin and deck. That means learning the helm controls, the radar systems, the navigation protocols, and the emergency procedures." "When do we start?" "Tonight. You'll shadow me in the pilot house for the next 20 crossings. Learn the instruments. After that, you'll take the helm on calm nights while I supervise. After 50, you'll be certified for solo relief operations." For the next month, I spent every crossing in the pilot house learning the controls. Voss walked me through the throttle response curves, the radar interpretation protocols, the radio channels and emergency codes. He taught me how to read the water in low light, how to gauge the wind's effect on our approach angles, how to manage the timing on the docking procedures. On the 146th night, with 3 passengers aboard and seas at 2 feet, he stepped back from the helm. "You're crossing," he said. I took the wheel. The vessel felt different from the captain's position, heavier, more responsive, more present. I made the course adjustments by feel, compensating for the current and the wind. We passed mile marker 7 at the correct distance. We docked at Kirkland at 03:32, 2 minutes ahead of schedule. We docked at Moss Harbor at 04:47, 3 minutes ahead. At 0600, Voss logged my first captain qualification. "Clean crossing, good instincts. You're ready for calm weather relief." On the 152nd night, operations transmitted updates to 3 amendments. Amendment 1 revision. If you smell copper or ozone in the passenger cabin between midnight and 04, open all windows and doors for exactly 90 seconds, then close and seal them. If the smell returns within 5 minutes, repeat the ventilation protocol. If it returns a 3rd time, reduce speed to half and radio for emergency assessment. Amendment 4 revision. Between 01:45 and 02:05, do not respond to any passenger requests that involve going below deck or accessing storage areas. If a passenger insists more than twice, note their name and seat. If they insist a third time, radio the captain for assessment. Amendment 7 revision. If a passenger sneezes, coughs, or vomits more than 7 times in a 5-minute period, observe them carefully. If their eyes are bloodshot, or if they speak in a language different from what they used when boarding, or if they exhibit sudden memory loss about their boarding location, isolate them in the forward storage area and radio for medical assessment protocols. Voss briefed me on the changes. Each revision comes from a new incident. Amendment 1. We had a case where single ventilation didn't clear it. Amendment 4. Passenger broke through a locked door trying to get below deck. Amendment 7. We had a passenger forget where they'd boarded mid-crossing, then start speaking Mandarin when their manifest showed they'd boarded using English. What happened to them? Inlet station took them for assessment. Chen says they recovered after 3 days, but couldn't remember anything about the crossing. On the 161st night, I encountered my first Amendment 7 case. A passenger named Kowalski boarded at 23:58. Manifest showed him as a contractor heading to Moss Harbor. He spoke English when I verified his name. At 01:37, he sneezed 4 times in quick succession. I noted it but didn't start a formal count. Seasonal allergies were common. At 01:41, he sneezed 3 more times. 7 total. I checked my watch and started the 5-minute timer. At 01:43, he sneezed twice more. 9 total within 2 minutes. I moved closer to observe. His eyes looked normal in the dim light. At 01:45, he stopped sneezing. I waited. The 5-minute window would close at 01:46. No more sneezing, 9 total, but under the threshold. I noted it in my log but didn't radio. At 01:52, Kowalski stood and walked to the galley. I followed at a distance. He poured coffee, added sugar, and returned to his seat. Everything normal. At 02:08, he spoke. I was standing near enough to hear. He was talking to himself quietly in what sounded like Russian or Polish. I moved closer. "Sir, are you all right?" He looked at me. His eyes were clear but unfocused. "Gdzie ja jestem?" I didn't speak Polish, but I recognized the sounds from my logging of previous incidents. "Sir, can you tell me your name?" "Kowalski? Ja jestem." "Gdzie?" He blinked and rubbed his face. "Where am I?" "You're on the ferry. You boarded at Port Ahern. Do you remember boarding?" He stared at me. No, I don't. Where was I? Amendment 7, language shift and memory loss. I keyed the radio immediately. "Captain, Amendment 7 in effect. Passenger Kowalski. Language shift to Polish. Memory loss regarding boarding. Requesting medical assessment protocols." "Copy. Isolate and forward storage. I'm coming down." I approached Kowalski carefully. "Sir, I need you to come with me. We have a medical concern." "Medical? I feel fine." "Precautionary. Please follow me." He stood and followed me to the forward storage area. The space was narrow but secure with a bench and adequate ventilation. I helped him sit. "Stay here. The captain will be down in a moment to check on you." "What's wrong with me?" "We're not sure yet. Just stay here and try to remain calm." Voss arrived 2 minutes later with a medical kit. He checked Kowalski's vitals, pulse, temperature, pupil response. Everything normal except for the ongoing memory gaps. "Do you know where you live?" Voss asked. "Anchorage, I think. Or maybe Kirkland?" "I'm not sure." "Do you know what day it is?" "Wednesday, Thursday, I don't know." Voss radioed operations. They patched him through to the inlet station medical team. After a 5-minute consultation, they authorized emergency protocols. Keep Kowalski isolated until docking, then transfer him directly to inlet medical for assessment. We docked at Kirkland at 03:32. A medical team was waiting. They took Kowalski off the vessel on a stretcher, though he was walking and alert. He kept asking where he was. Chen was there too. She pulled me aside. Good catch. The language shift is usually the key indicator. If you'd waited until the memory loss became more severe, he might not have recovered. Will he be okay? Usually they recover. We've had 8 cases like this over the last 3 years. 6 made full recovery, 2 have permanent gaps in their memory of the crossing but are otherwise fine. What causes it? We think it's exposure to something during specific conditions, possibly related to the port side phenomena or the marker entities. We're still studying it. She glanced at the medical team loading Kowalski into their vehicle. But catching them early makes a difference. On the 174th night, a winter storm moved into the region. Voss called me at 1800. Operations is clearing us for the crossing, but it's going to be rough. Seas building to 8 feet, winds 30 knots, visibility less than a quarter mile. I need you sharp tonight. Understood. We'll have minimal passengers. Nobody travels in this weather unless they have to. But the rules don't change just because the conditions are worse. Stay focused. At 2300, the wind was howling across the dock and spray was coming over the pilings in sheets. 1 passenger boarded, a ranger named Torres who needed to get to Kirkland for an emergency supply run. She wore a heavy survival suit and carried a waterproof pack. Rough night, she said. Yes, ma'am, stay seated and hang on. At midnight, we departed. The ferry pitched heavily as soon as we cleared the dock. I stood in the pilot house next to Voss, watching him work the throttle and wheel to keep us on course. The radar showed the channel clearly, but visibility through the windscreen was nearly 0. I need you watching the radar, Voss said. Call out any contacts, any deviations from the channel markers. I'm flying on instruments. Contact at 035 degrees, 1,000 meters, stationary. Marker buoy. Copy. We pushed through the storm. The cabin lights went off at 0045. I went below to check on Torres. She was strapped into her seat with the bench harness, eyes closed, not moving. I checked her pulse at the wrist. Normal. Breathing normal. Just enduring the crossing. At 0110, the restroom window opened. The ferry was rolling 20 degrees in the swells. No one tried to use the restroom. At 0200, I conducted the count. 1 passenger, secure. I radioed the report and Voss acknowledged. At 0215, the port window period began. I stayed on the starboard side, gripping the rail for balance as the ferry pitched. The storm was so intense I couldn't see the water on either side, just spray and darkness. But I kept my eyes starboard anyway. At 0305, we approached Kirkland through the worst of the storm. Voss threaded the ferry between the channel markers with precision, compensating for the wind and the current by feel. We docked hard, rougher than usual but secure. Torres disembarked without speaking, moving quickly across the pitching dock toward the station lights. The return crossing was worse. Empty ferry, lighter, riding higher in the swells. We rolled 30 degrees at one point and I thought we might capsize, but Voss adjusted the throttle and brought us back level. At 0600, we tied up at Port Ahern. The sky was beginning to lighten, but the storm wasn't breaking. Voss shut down the instruments and turned to me. That was a Category 3 crossing. You handled it well. Most people get seasick or disoriented. You stayed focused on procedures. Thank you, sir. Winter's going to bring more of these, maybe 2 or 3 per month. If you're still here in February, you'll be taking some of them solo. I'll be ready. On the 188th night, Chen boarded with her equipment again. Follow-up observation, she said. The data from my last run showed something unusual. I need to confirm it. She set up her sensors and logged data throughout the crossing. At 0240, just after the port window closed, she called me over. Look at this, she said, showing me her laptop screen. It displayed a graph with multiple colored lines oscillating in complex patterns. This is real-time measurement of electromagnetic variance, gravitational microfluctuations, and something we call temporal coherence. I don't understand the data. You don't need to. Just look at this spike. She pointed to a sharp peak in the blue line. That happened at 02:33, right in the middle of your port window. Every crossing I've measured, there's a spike at almost the exact same time. Whatever's causing the portside phenomena, it's generating a measurable distortion. What kind of distortion? We're not sure. It doesn't match any known physics. It's like space-time is flexing slightly. Not enough to be dangerous, but enough to measure, and it's getting stronger. Should we be concerned? We're always concerned. But the pattern is stable. It spikes, it drops, it repeats. As long as it stays stable and we keep following the rules, we maintain the boundary. She saved her data and closed the laptop. The rules aren't arbitrary, they're mapped to these distortions. When operations updates a rule, it's because the distortion pattern changed and we need to adjust our behavior to match. So we're not just avoiding danger. We're actively negotiating space. Exactly. She packed her equipment. Most people think the rules are about safety. They are, but they're also about communication. We follow the rules, the phenomena respond, we adjust, they adjust. It's a language made of procedures. At 03:30, she disembarked at Kirkland. Before she left, she handed me a USB drive. My data from tonight. Keep it. If something happens to my main files, you'll have a backup. And if anything changes dramatically, if you see patterns that don't match what I've shown you, let me know immediately. I took the drive and locked it in my locker. On the 200th night, Voss called me to the pilot house before the shift. You've made it to 200, he said. That puts you the top 3% of all deckhands who've worked this route. Only 7 people have made it to 300. Only 2 have made it to 5. How many have you done? 1,143. I've been captain for 8 years. He pulled out a small wooden box from his desk drawer. This is for you. Operations sends them for milestone crossings. Inside was a brass pin, simple design. A Ferry silhouette with the number 200 below it. I turned it over in my hand. It was surprisingly heavy. Thank you. You've earned it. You're reliable, you follow procedures, and you're developing good instincts. When I eventually leave this route, you'll be qualified to take the captain position if you want it. I'll think about it. No rush, but keep doing what you're doing. He closed the box. 200 is when most people decide. Either they commit to making this their career or they realize they've had enough and they move on. Both choices are valid. That night, I pinned the brass marker to my jacket and ran the crossing with extra focus. 4 passengers, 0 incidents, all procedures followed precisely. At 0600, I logged my 200th crossing and added a note, milestone reached. Continuing. On the 212th night, I encountered something that wasn't covered by any rule. The manifest showed 3 passengers. They boarded normally at 23:58. I verified all 3 names. At midnight, we departed. The crossing proceeded routinely through the first 2 hours. At 0200, I conducted the passenger count. 3 visible, all accounted for. At 0215, I moved to the starboard side for the port window period. At 0233, exactly when Chen's data had shown the spike, I felt something change. Not a sound, not a visual change, just a shift in the air pressure or the way time flowed. The ferry's engines maintained their rhythm, but everything felt slightly delayed, like watching a video with the audio track off by a fraction of a second. I stayed on the starboard side and counted my breaths. The sensation lasted approximately 90 seconds, then normalized. At 0236, I turned and conducted a visual check of the port side. The windows were dark and wet, nothing pressed against the glass. But on the deck outside, visible through the window, there was something that hadn't been there before. A rope coil. Standard marine rope, about 10 meters, neatly coiled. Sitting on the deck 15 meters from the port door. I hadn't put it there. It wasn't part of our deck equipment. It hadn't been there during my last check at 0200. I photographed it through the window, then keyed the radio. Captain. Unidentified rope coil on port deck. Appeared between 0200 and 0236. No manifest entry. Amendment 6 protocol. Copy. Do not go outside to mark it. Photograph from inside and monitor. If it moves, report immediately. I took multiple photos from different angles through the window. The rope looked completely ordinary. Standard marine 3 strands, slightly worn, nothing unusual about its construction or condition except that it hadn't existed before. At 0300 I checked again. Still there, same position. At 0330 we docked at Kirkland. After the passengers disembarked, I went out on the port deck to examine the rope more closely. It was gone. The deck was empty. No rope, no mark where it had been, no residue. I photographed the empty space and radioed the report. Rope no longer present, disappeared between 0236 and 0332. No physical trace. Copy. Continue normal operations. At 0600 I reported to Voss. He reviewed my photos carefully, zooming in on the details. First time you've seen a materialized object? He asked. Yes, sir. Amendment 6 covers objects that appear, but this one appeared during a time window that's covered by different rules. Port window is 2:15 to 2:35. Object appeared at or just before 0233 inside that window. Good catch. That's a boundary case. The object doesn't fit cleanly into either rule category. He made a note in his log. I'll flag it for operations. This might trigger a new rule or an amendment revision. Should I have done anything differently? No. You documented it properly and didn't interact with it. That's correct procedure for any anomaly. He closed his log, but keep your eyes open. If objects start appearing regularly during the port window, that's a pattern change. Could mean the phenomena are overlapping or evolving. I added a detailed entry to my notebook. Port deck materialization. 0233 boundary case between Amendment 6 and port window rule. Rope coil, standard marine construction. Duration 56 minutes. No physical trace after disappearance. On the 223rd night, operations transmitted Rule 16. 16. If the ferry's compass reading deviates by more than 5 degrees from the expected heading for longer than 30 seconds, and the radar shows the channel markers in their correct positions, do not attempt to correct the heading. Note the time and deviation amount. Radio the captain using code phrase, navigation variance confirmed. Maintain current course until the compass realigns. Voss briefed me on it. This is a new one. We've had 3 incidents in the last month where the compass showed us off course, but all other instruments and visual references confirmed we were tracking correctly. One captain overcorrected based on the compass, and we ended up 20 meters off the channel. Took 40 minutes to get back on course. So we trust the radar over the compass. We trust the convergence of multiple inputs. If the compass and radar and visual all agree, we're on course. If only the compass disagrees, it's experiencing localized distortion, and we ignore it until it realigns. That night, we crossed in calm conditions with 5 passengers. At 00:57, I was in the pilot house checking the instruments when I noticed the compass needle drift. We were heading roughly southwest at 230 degrees, but the compass showed 241, 11 degrees off. I watched it for 30 seconds. The deviation held steady at 11 degrees. Radar showed all channel markers in correct positions. Visual reference through the windscreen matched the radar. I keyed the radio. Navigation variance confirmed. Compass deviation 11 degrees, duration 35 seconds, all other instruments nominal. Copy. Maintain current course. Do not adjust. I kept my hands off the wheel and watched the compass. For 90 seconds it held at 11 degrees off, the needle pointing to a heading that didn't match our actual course. Then gradually it began to drift back. At 00:59 and 45 seconds, it realigned with our true heading. Compass realigned. Variance duration 2 minutes 48 seconds. Good. Note it and continue. I logged the incident. Rule 16 protocol. 00:57 to 00:59. Compass deviation 11 degrees. Radar and visual confirmed true heading maintained. No course correction required. On the 237th night, I took my first solo crossing. Voss called in sick with what operations confirmed as legitimate flu. They authorized me for solo captain operations under calm weather protocols. The manifest showed 2 passengers, seas were 1 foot, winds 5 knots, visibility unlimited. I ran the pre-departure checklist alone, checking every system twice. At 23:58, the passengers boarded. I verified their names from the helm position, watching through the pilot house window as my relief deckhand, a new hire named Torres, checked their tickets. At midnight, I pushed the throttle forward and we departed Port Ahern. The ferry responded smoothly to my inputs. I called out the procedures to Torres over the radio, walking him through each check, each timing window, each observation point. He followed precisely, his voice steady on the radio. At 02:33, I felt the familiar temporal shift, that moment when Chen's data showed the spike. I maintained course and speed. Torres reported the port window clear at 02:36. At 03:30, we docked at Kirkland. Both passengers disembarked. At 04:45, we docked at Moss Harbor. Empty ferry for the return. At 0600, I tied up at Port Ahern and completed the shutdown procedures. Torres met me on the dock. "Clean crossing, Captain," he said. The title felt strange, but I nodded. "Good work tonight. You followed procedures exactly." I walked back to the bunkhouse and logged the crossing. Solo captain qualification, crossing 237. 2 passengers, 0 incidents. All procedures followed, weather calm. New deckhand Torres performed adequately. Then I counted my keys. 7. I hung them in the locker and lay on my bunk, listening to the wind outside and the sound of the water against the pilings. The debt was nearly paid. I could leave in another month if I wanted to, but Chen's data suggested the patterns were still evolving. The phenomena were still adjusting to our adjustments. And someone needed to be here to document it, to maintain the procedures, to hold the boundary. I'd made it to 237 crossings. Voss had made it to 1143. The record was somewhere past 5,000, held by a captain who'd retired 15 years ago. I pulled out my notebook and opened to a blank page. At the top I wrote, "Crossing 238, notes and observations." Then I closed the book and slept.